On behalf of Shadow Mountain Community Church and Christian Heritage College, we welcome you to the debate between Dr. Doolittle and Dr. Gish. And we're glad that you're with us tonight, and let's welcome our guests, shall we? Dr. Doolittle, we thank you for coming and being involved in the debate with Dr. Gish. We thank you for coming as well. In just a moment, I'll turn it over to Pastor Carl Payne. Before I do, let me let you know that in the back, as you came in tonight, there are some tables. There's materials on the table, both from the Institute for Creation Research. Plenty of materials there. We encourage you to stop by and see what is there, and there are men and women who will help you. Also, there is a booth to let you know more about Christian Heritage College, one of the hosts for the debate that we have tonight. So please feel free to stop by as well. As a student, as a parent, we'll be glad to give you some information. I want to take a moment now and introduce to you the man who really is responsible for putting all of this together. He is our college pastor. He has a tremendous love for people, and he has been the one instrumental behind the scenes to organize the whole evening, to make you feel welcome and comfortable here, to get Dr. Gish and Dr. Doolittle to come and put their schedules together. We appreciate so much what Carl Payne means to the church and the college here. He will be the moderator for the evening. Let us welcome Pastor Carl Payne.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make just a few quick remarks, and then we'll get after the business that is at hand. The first one would be this, and I mean this sincerely. If you are an ardent advocate of either the evolutionist position or creation science position, or possibly you have come curious, I don't know what I believe about that, I've watched it go back and forth, you are a welcome guest, and we are glad to have people, whatever position you're sitting in here. It would be my hope that this debate would produce instructive light rather than emotional heat. It's hot enough in this place already. We don't need that. If you have come thinking that it is going to be a dog and pony show, cute remarks, crass remarks, I hope you go home very disappointed. That is not at all what we're about or what we're wanting, and I know both of the doctors, we've talked about that, and they feel the same way. If you have a chance to listen, if you have a chance to be stretched, if you have a chance to listen to two debaters who are very good, and walk away with a better understanding of both positions, then this evening will be a success, and that is surely what we were hoping for. As far as a brief overview, what we are going to be doing, both men will present opening presentations. They will have 55 minutes to do so. We wanted to be sure, and that may be long, my guess is it's going to go fast, but we wanted both men to have the opportunity to thoroughly present their position and not be cut by time. We will have a 5-minute break between the two longer presentations. They will have a 15-minute rebuttal time. We will give them 10 minutes to prepare. And I would like to request of you that after the opening presentations, when they are up here preparing their rebuttal remarks, if you would leave them alone and give them some peace so that they can think. I'm sure they would be glad to talk with you afterwards, but they're going to want that time to be able to think. After the 15-minute rebuttal, both gentlemen will be given 5 minutes to conclude. They have both agreed to take about a 45-minute Q&A, question and answer time, and we're looking forward to that. You should have on your chair a 3x5 card or something close to that. If you have questions that you would like submitted for the question and answer time, we have a number of people that will be up and down the rows with little badges that say usher, and they will be collecting those during the breaks. So if you want to write them out during the break time, hand it to one of the people, says usher. I'm certain we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will try to get through as many as we can and be as fair in that representation as possible. I have two quick requests that I would like to make, and I hope that you will honor these men and this whole night with this. The first would be this. I believe with all my heart that both of these men are experts. They have both made major impacts in the particular disciplines that they have invested a lifetime in. I do not believe either one should be treated as a hero or a villain. I believe they're educators. I believe we can all learn from both of them. And I would like that we treat both of them with the dignity and respect that I believe both of them deserve. And I can't make you do that, but I can only hope that that would be the right thing to do. I was thinking whether you believe we are part of a product of a divine creation, or whether you believe we are at this point the pinnacle of what has evolved thus far. I believe there would be an agreement among all of us that men and women ought to be treated with dignity. And I believe this is a place where we can demonstrate that and we can show that. And I would not want to be one to not do that, and I hope you would feel the same way. Secondly, Tom has already mentioned this, but I'll say it again. We are in a big building, and the sound is going to be going everywhere. Just as I would hope we would show respect to our two guests, I would hope that we can show respect to one another by making sure people that want to hear have a chance to hear. Because your voice is going to bounce. If you start talking with each other, somebody is not going to get to hear. When we're done on breaks, you say anything you want to say, but show each other enough respect that we would be able to hear. The question for tonight: the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation of the scientific evidence as related to origins. We had a flip of the coin, and Dr. Doolittle will be speaking first. Dr. Doolittle, thank you.
If I had known it was going to be this warm, I would have worn my suspenders. I feel like Clarence Darrow with William Jennings Bryan here, and that fan a little bit back and forth in the courtroom. I realize that's a little beyond the average age of this audience to know who Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan were, what they were debating, but it was a similar situation in some ways. I'm going to use my 55 minutes here according to the following plan. First, I'm going to spend about 5 minutes explaining why I accepted Carl Payne's invitation to come here this evening. Then I'm going to spend another 5 minutes discussing my own view of what I consider to be a contradiction in terms, which is creation science or creation research. Then I'm going to take the bulk of the time, 45 minutes, and try and tell you my own personal view, at least in a 45-minute version, of what evolution is all about. Now, I'm going to start with the first 5 minutes, as I say, explaining this. And the best way I can explain it is to give you some personal history of my interaction with Dr. Gish before. It all began sometime early in the 1970s. I was a young person on the faculty at the University of California, typical, I suppose, disinterested scientist, egghead educator type. And one day, some young folk showed up in my office and said, "Hey, Prof, there's going to be some guy talking in the cafeteria tonight saying that evolution isn't so. Do you think you could come over and say a few words and set him straight about all this?" Me? Well, sure, I'm flattered. Well, I'll run right over. So I threw a few slides into my pocket. They all had to do with some very narrow and esoteric part of the work that I was doing. And went over and I met this very debonair, friendly man and said, "Oh, glad to meet you," and all that. I said, "Well, why don't we have your views first?" Well, of course, that was very gracious of him, and so I stood up in front of this assembled group, which I should have noticed was exceptionally well groomed for the times in that early 1970s. At any rate, I made my presentation in the usual befuddled professorial way, all sorts of things that nobody could possibly have understood, but I was very excited about them. These were things I was working on. I was working on the structure of proteins. We were getting the first arrangement of the amino acids out, and we're looking at them from different creatures, fish and frogs and chickens, and I could line up the arrangements, and it was all very thrilling. Well, I finished my presentation, and there was polite applause, and then the other man came on. And I must say, for 45 minutes, I just cowered under my chair. He cut me to ribbons. I mean, he read quotations from books from eminent authorities. He started out, he said, "This man is going to tell you that you're evolved from a fish? Are you going to believe that? You're going to just take that?" And he went on. Well, as I say, I was demolished. It was just, I couldn't believe it, all the things that came spouting out in that next 45 minutes. Well, there was a small chance of rebuttal, and I was beside myself. Where to begin? I mean, I had never heard such a collection of things that taken out of context. Amazing. Well, I hid. I gave it up, and just decided it's one of those experiences in life that one lives through. Well, it was about a year later, I got a telephone call from a man at San Diego State. And the man at San Diego State said, "Listen, there's some man coming around who wants to debate us on the business of creation versus evolution. And somebody told me that you had a debate with this fella." I said, "Was his name Dr. Gish?" He said, "That's the guy." "Wait, let me tell you now. Whoa, before you get into this, don't go in unprepared." Now, in fact, we got together and collaborated. And in one of the most spectacular evenings of my own life, I must say, 4 people from UCSD and San Diego State took on 4 people from the Creation Research Institute here, led by Dr. Gish, in what was a marathon discussion and debate over at San Diego State, Montezuma Hall. Now, this time we were ready. Every file card that came out from the other side, we had an antidote file card ready. We knew all these arguments, and as the balloons were let up, we were puncturing them right and left. Well, the end was over, and I thought, well, this was the night. We really showed them this time. So the moderator got up in front, and after this, which we were all sitting there so smugly, the 4 on our side, said, "Well, this was quite a debate." He said, "Now, before I take a vote to find out who won this debate, I'd like to know first, how many of you out there had your minds changed or your positions changed by anything you heard tonight?" About 2 hands went up. All right, he said, "Well, so much for that." He said, "Now, how many of you out there think the good professors from the universities here won the debate tonight?" Scattered applause, our few friends that went. "How many people think that the men from the Institute for Creation Research won the debate tonight?" Oh, the roof nearly blew off Montezuma Hall. I mean, I thought that there was a volcano underneath it. I mean, it was, well, lesson number 2 was learned by this experience. So lesson number 1 was, never get into one of these things unprepared. Lesson number 2 was, even when you go into them prepared, be watching out for trouble and don't think that you're going to change anybody's opinion about anything. Well, I withdrew from the competition. And it was now about 5 years later, I got a telephone call from a place in Iowa, Ames, Iowa. Someone introduced himself, said he was from the Students for Origin Research. And he was calling to find out if I'd be interested in going out to Iowa to debate somebody. I said, "No, I don't do that sort of thing." It turned out he had called one of my colleagues, and my colleagues demurred, being smarter than I, and suggested me. And so he didn't even know the history. And he begged me and said they had already rented a hall and everything. And I said, "By the way, who's the opponent?" He said, "Oh, it's Dr. Gish." Well, like Captain Ahab thinking about Moby Dick out there, I couldn't resist. So off to Iowa I went. And here I was ready. I knew how all this worked by this time. I know the business about who goes first and so on. And there was going to be the same format we're using tonight. approximately an hour for one guy, an hour for the other, 15 minutes rebuttal, 15 minutes rebuttal, 5 minutes break, so forth, 5 minutes. Well, it was run by the debate coach, and it was clear to me that the strategy in these things is very much, in spite of what we may have heard from Carl Payne, very much puncture the other guy's arguments. This is the clue to success here. And so if you go first, you can't do that because he hasn't said them yet. And so when the debate coach said, well, now who's going first this time? And this time, Duane was going to graciously let me say, well, wait a minute, let me think this through. Who's debating the affirmative here? And I was prepared, no matter what the debate coach said, to feel that he probably didn't know the rules of debate anyway. So they figured it out that, well, Duane was the affirmative. I said, well, then he goes first. So, Duane went first. I was ready this time. Well, we went through it, and I would say that I enjoyed that night very much, and I won't give you my opinion of the outcome, but I'll tell you, it was about a year later when I got a call from Duane himself, and he said, Russ, how about a rematch? Now, I felt that a rematch was some kind of concession there, that in fact it couldn't be just this wasn't just another stop on the itinerary around the country, this was something big. And in fact, we went on to a big one, as many of you may know, back at Lynchburg, back in Jerry Falwell's at his university, and with a night to remember. I'll just leave it at that. Well, I myself was prepared to retire then and just withdraw from the business. I thought that it was interesting, but I had no illusions about how much good I might or might not do in these things. And I stood aside for just about the next 10 years. In fact, about 3 years ago, I received a phone call inviting me to debate Dr. Gish at UCSD, and I said, I'm sorry, I'm busy. I really was, but I didn't do it. And instead, he was debated by Professor Thwaites from San Diego State, who has had an even longer, not longer standing, but certainly of greater intensity, duration relationship with Dr. Gish. They have debated on many occasions. They know each other's arguments so well that they can now rebut each other by formula. They can say things like A42 and the other one comes back with G7. It's that kind of game. So they know their strengths and weaknesses. Well, when the call came from Carl Payne here, my first reaction was, well, no, I can't do it again. Why not get Bill Thwaites? But then I thought, no, this is somewhat different. There are several differences in why, in fact, I came. First one was to recognize that, well, I must tell you that I'm rather fond of Duane Gish, and I wanted to see him again. I hadn't in a long time, and I thought, well, chances are running out, time is going on, better go over for one last handshake and see him again. Secondly, my curiosity. I wondered, I'm thinking, has that old codger got some new arguments going? I mean, has he been keeping up with genetic engineering? Does he really know about gene transfers and so on? Has he been following the sequence business with great authority the way he used to so that he could try to puncture holes in other arguments? My curiosity did bring me back. However, I would be less than truthful if I didn't tell you that I always also enjoy the adventure of baiting the lion in his own den. I thought a chance to come down here is really quite different than arguing on our own turf up at UCSD. In other words, I'm here with a little bit in the back of my mind of doing a little missionary spade work. Now, I want to caution you out there, you may be sitting next to a closet agnostic, that I, in fact, may just reach some neuron that hasn't yet been ossified, and I may get and send out a whole seed of free thinkers as a result of this. The kinetics are in my favor. Now, just to make the point, I'm going to show you how, in fact, that best night back in Iowa began, and the strategy I used, and which I think is successful. And to make the point, I started it by saying, I'd like to take a little poll. I'd like to start by asking now of this audience, how many of you out there already accept the principles of natural evolution and feel that that's the way that life has occurred on this earth and developed the way it is. I'd like you to stand up. Well, not too bad, not too bad. Okay, but I think in Iowa we counted 15. All right? Now you can see I've got my work cut out for me. And I'm thinking that among the other 2,000 of you out there, I'm going to go away with a few, if not converts, at least some restless thinking. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about creation research or creation science. I have to also say something about what Carl Payne said, that he hopes we won't have any cute remarks or things that are in bad taste. I have to explain that in the course of these debates that Duane and I have had, or he has had with Bill Thwaites, we did meet on another occasion. I just remembered there was another case where the American Association for the Advancement of Science invited Duane in to join us. At any rate, in these, we do often throw a few barbs at each other, but you mustn't think there's anything personal about this. This is just our way of debating. It's a part of the game. It's a little bit like those professional wrestlers you see on television. They're not really hurting each other. Occasionally I'll notice Duane wince here and there, but most of the time it's being done with a good thought behind it. So don't get excited. Now I'm only going to give you my personal view about some of the things, and especially about some of these organizations that I've met. You mustn't feel bad about it because they're only my opinions. But they're very much like, well, I'm going to do it by analogy, and I'm going to tell you a story, and that this, I think, will make the point better than me trying to take it piecemeal about where I think it's gone wrong. I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to give you the reference for it first. This is a story that was described in an issue of the Smithsonian Magazine about 10 or a dozen years ago by a man I know named Bob Shadowald. It was a very well-written piece. And it had to do with England in the 19th century. And the man who is the anti-hero of this story was a man named John Hampden. Now, John was a well-educated person. He had gone to Oxford, the equivalent of going to a good university here in the state of California. And his particular thing was sort of military science. And he had this great plan for the defense of Britain and everything. But in fact, it wasn't politically correct at the time, and he found himself on the outs, and he became somewhat embittered by the experience. And at about that time, he found the Bible and became a strict literalist about the interpretation of the Bible. He also found at about that time a book written by someone that was entitled The Curvature of the Earth as a Fallacy. It was, in fact, one of these books that was written to prove that the earth is not round at all. Now, Hampden became such a convert about all of this that he put an advertisement in the London Times of London, £500. And the £500 was going to be to anybody who could convince, and it was put down as an intelligent referee, that the world really is round by virtue of showing. And what was going to be looked for now was a convex body. Now, it could be a railroad track, a lake, a river, a canal. If you could prove that the earth was round by showing convexity, then in fact, he would deliver this £500. Well, ironically, a taker, the person who came on to challenge him, was Alfred Russel Wallace. Russel Wallace was the other person to come up with the theory of natural selection just at about the same time as Darwin, a very highly regarded scientist in the 19th century, and he thought, well, this is easy. I can do this, no problem at all. So how was he going to do this? Well, I have a little transparency to show you his trick, but I'm going to tell you about it first, and then we'll look at the transparency. It happened that there is a canal someplace outside of London that runs for 6 miles between bridges and is ostensibly a perfectly flat body of water. But if you do the arithmetic for something 6 miles long, there should be enough curvature there that if you stood on one bridge and looked up at the next bridge 6 miles away, and you had a marker in the middle, you should be able to see that the marker was not lined up bridge to bridge. So in fact, this was the arrangement that was going to be done. Now let me just explain the experiment here. Hope the light's going to come on here. All right, I don't know if you can all see this or not, but here's the canal, 6 miles, and you see that I've drawn curvature in there. That was, of course, what they're trying to find. And the arithmetic was that if you put 3 markers up there, they're all going to be the same distance above the water, 13 feet 4 inches. All right? So there are the guys down over in that end. They have a telescope. And they line the telescope up from one marker to the marker on the other bridge. And when they do that, of course, it goes right under the one that's in the middle. In fact, the arithmetic showed that it should be passing 5 feet under the middle marker. So they did the experiment. And I have to tell you one other thing. Hamden had said, well, now we have to have a referee. I'm not going to judge this. We're going to let a referee judge this. So a referee was picked, and the man who was picked was actually the head of the equivalent of a Nature magazine in England at the time. But then Hamden had some second thoughts and said, well, maybe we need 2 referees. And so he had another man come on who by chance was the publisher of one of these flat earth pamphlets. So the referee from the Nature magazine looked through there and said, well, clearly the marker is up above the other markers here. The other man looked through, said, they look lined up to me. Well, what are we going to do about this? It's a tie. They said, well, now, he said, furthermore, we haven't done the experiment correctly. The telescope isn't level. Well, Russell Wallace pointed out if the telescope was leveled, it would go right over the other marker. And so they got a surveyor's level in, and they lined it up, and they looked through the telescope, and sure enough, the marker from the middle was up above the marker on the bridge. And with that, the man from the other side said, see, it proves it. They're flat because they're equal distances apart. Well, Wallace was just frustrated beyond belief. I mean, this kind of logic, well, how was anything going to be explained? Well, with that, the man came back and said, clearly the answer is atmospheric refraction. Atmospheric refraction, Wallace said. What's that? Well, the light is bending because of atmospheric refraction. Obviously, it's still flat. They're lined up perfectly. Well, it ended up anyway 10 years in the courts, but eventually Wallace got his money. In the meantime, however, the Flat Earth Society membership exploded. It was carried in the newspaper every day about this experiment on the flat lake, and it turns out the lake is flat. The Flat Earth Society prospered as a result of all of this. Now, in fact, of course, there are flat Earth people here in California still today, headquartered up in Lancaster. I've been told that every year the president takes a round-trip airplane trip around the world and showing that they're really going in a big circle. I mean, nobody can see the curve as they go along. He gets off and said, just proves it, right where I started, because we went in a circle. Now, what is the point? The point is that it's very easy to obfuscate, all right, to muddy the waters and get publicity and get a lot of people to say yay, yay, and join societies. It is especially easy in a society where the science is becoming increasingly complex and where I find that half of our college juniors can't do algebra and all things of this sort. It's very easy to muddy the waters. Now, I'm not going to say that there is an exact parallel between the Flat Earth Society and some of the creation research that I've seen, but there are some intriguing similarities, and during the evening I'm going to pin some down. Now, as for the main course, which is what we're going to get into now. First, as you know, I lost the toss and had to go first. I'm going to do a little guessing about some of the things that Dr. Gish is going to say tonight. These are guessing, they're wonderings on my part. As far as cute sayings are concerned, some of the ones that I remember from the past are evolution, or, as some say, from fish to gish, and others will say later, too little to do little, all right, well, or we will have things about hydrogen, a tasteless, invisible, odorless gas that changes into human beings. Ah, yes. And he will say things like, you know, it's called mythology when a frog changes into a prince in an instant, but if it takes 200 million years, then it's evolution and science. Well, true enough, I think. So I'm here to find out whether or not these lines are going to change, whether there will be new cosmic chickens and eggs tonight or not. So I'm going to now begin the part. I'm going to send up my balloon, and he can start getting ready his little darts to see if he can shoot some of these down. All right, I'm going to begin by telling you what my own view of evolution is all about. And in all of this, in all seriousness now, I've gotten all my sort of jocularity out. You have to sort of, when you're nervous at the beginning, get some of those just out to get yourself going. Now we can get serious. Tell you that Dr. Gish does make some very good points about the difference between observation and inference. And very much of science is based on interpretation. You see things, we can all agree we see things, but it's a matter of how you interpret them that matters. So I'm going to try to distinguish the observation from the inference for some of these principles that I'm going to put before you. The first one that I'm going to take out is not an inference, it's an observation. This is the principle of biochemical unity and diversity. Now, what the principle of unity and diversity is about is that all the living creatures on the earth today are made up of the same small molecules. Now, that's an observation, it's not an interpretation. Here are some of those small molecules. And we're going to be talking about a lot of them here in the next 20 or 30 minutes. These are a bunch of amino acids. Now, almost everybody knows that what amino acids are. You can read it in Newsweek or whatever, the building blocks of proteins. However, what you must understand is that every bacterium, every plant, every cow, every yeast, every virus, we all are made of the same starting 20 basic amino acids, these same fundamental ones. Now, it's important to understand that because we're going to make inferences about it. Now, this is how we're able to eat plants or eat funguses, whatever we want. We can eat them because it's our job to break down their proteins into these 20 amino acids and then put them together our way. 30 minutes. Now, I want to tell you a little bit. Even though there are 20 amino acids, this particular transparency only has a half dozen. And they are molecules made up of atoms. In nature, of course, they don't have these nice colors. We just put those colors on to depict them. And it gets cumbersome for the scientist, and so we increasingly are using shorthand. So here's an amino acid, valine, but writing valine all the time is a nuisance, and so we got to calling it val. But val got to be a nuisance, and so now we only call it V. Over here you can see, for example, proline. Here's a structure of proline over here, what it's made of, carbons, hydrogens, and a nitrogen, and so on. Here's its name, here's its abbreviation, but it's the P we're going to have for proline. So I'm going to be showing you slides in a few moments that are going to be filled with 20 letters, P's and R's and G's and V's, and they're going to be standing for these clumps of atoms, which are the building blocks of all proteins in all organisms. Now, besides the amino acids, there are other small molecules that are common to all the living creatures. These are the ones, what we call the bases that are found in nucleic acids. Adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, uracil, 4 or 5, depending on whether we're talking DNA, RNA. I'm going to make that clear in a moment, I hope. At any rate, those letters, which we'll be using only 4 at a time, will be on some other slides, DNA sequences or RNA sequences. So the principle of unity is we're all made of the same small molecules. The diversity is also an observation, not an inference. The difference between us and a plant or a horse or a bacterium or a virus is we're made of the same building blocks, but they've been put together in a different order. All right? It's the same building blocks, but the order is different. Now we have a word for the order, the arrangement. These things are strung together in chains. The word we use is sequence. It just means you think of a railroad train made up of 100 railroad cars. All right, they're all made of flat cars and coal cars and tankers and so on. But what kind of a train it is just depends on the order in which the flat cars and so on occur. And out of that comes all diversity. Now, here comes the inference. The inference is that because we're all made of the same things, and the only thing that matters is the order, in fact, we must have all come from a common ancestor. Now, there's a lot more to why we think we came to a common ancestor. There's a big leap. But what I'm going to tell you that, of course, is the going principle of modern evolution is that all the creatures on the earth today are descended from a common ancestor. Sometime in history, all the creatures on this earth converged back at one creature, and that was the great-great-great-great-great-grandparent of us all right? And the diversity came by now having this genetic material, these DNAs or RNAs, go through what we call descent with modification. And the principle of natural selection that follows from this is that somehow changes are brought about in these chains during the course of time, and the ones that come out well, they win the lottery. Those that don't do so well, they lose the lottery. Essentially, so there are even some, it's just like our own lottery in California. Sometimes you can just not win or lose. You can change, but it doesn't matter. I'm sure many of you have bought 5 lottery tickets for $5. I suppose that's what they cost. I've never bought one myself. And maybe you won $5, and you say, well, nothing ventured, nothing lost there, it was a gain. Well, that's another thing that happens in evolution. There are winners, losers, and no cost ones that occur here. All right, now I'm going to have to show you some transparencies about how this works. I can get these up here. We're prisoner, of course, to the videotape, which only goes for an hour, so we have to stay on time here. What we have here is an example of how these changes occur. This is now just taking a little bit of piece of DNA, what we call 4 of these bases, or 3 of them, depending on which one we're looking at, and we're going to mutate it. And these mutations occur just naturally. They're just little chemical mistakes that are constantly occurring. We see them all the time. They're something we can observe. They're not something that was imagined. And we have different kinds. Sometimes we just have a substitution, so that GAT changes to CAT. That's a simple substitution. Sometimes we have an insertion where there were 3, now there are 4. An extra base slipped in there during the chemistry of replication. Sometimes it duplicates, and where there was GAT, there is now GAT-GAT. And sometimes there's a deletion, where there used to be 6, now there are 4. So these things are going on all the time. All of us are experiencing these all the time. Now, of course, it only matters for us that the ones that are happening in our germ cells. And the ones that happen in our germ cells are passed on to our progeny. And that, of course, is the grist for the mill of evolution. You have to have changes in the genetic material, and then out of that, this tremendous lottery occurs of winners and losers going on all the time. Now, there are many, many, of course, hundreds of examples of this. We're going to be showing a lot of these replacements of how they change, but you all have probably played this game as children of how to change one word into another. Well, it's not so different. It's a matter here where we're going to accept the principle here in this change as we go up here from this word to this word, changing just one letter at a time. In this game over here, we've said it's got to be a real word for the intermediates now. And the trick is to see if you can get from here to here in the smallest number of steps, because we're going to adopt our explanations for what comes about evolution on a principle called the principle of parsimony. It means don't make things any more difficult than they are. That is, let us accept the simplest possible solution. When 2 things are virtually the same, let us presume that at one time they were the same and they've had a little bit of change, as opposed to starting from something random and now bringing them together. That will, I think, become clear when I show you some examples. Now, here comes my first example before we change over to slides. All right. Proteins. Proteins are what we are. DNA, RNA, that's the memory device by which now things are passed on from generation to generation. But proteins matter, and I'm going to show you a protein sequence before we switch over to the slides. This is an enzyme that all of us have that's responsible for our being able to digest sugar. In other words, every day we take in a certain amount of carbohydrate. It gets passed, and we have to change that into energy and heat to keep us going. No heat needed tonight, I can tell you here. At any rate, we have an enzyme called triose phosphate isomerase, one of a whole battery, but a great one. Now it happens that this enzyme is found in almost all living creatures on the earth, because even the bacteria have to be able to change sugars and get energy out of it. Certainly the plants and the fungi and the all sorts of other creatures do this. This is how many organisms get their sustenance. And so they all have this enzyme, and it's made up, it's one of these railroad trains. This one happens to be made up, in us, 271 railroad cars. Now I'm going to show you a comparison of it to one that is isolated from a bacterium, very common bacterium that we all have in our guts, one called E. coli. Now it turns out that one in E. coli happens to be a little longer. Their train is 275 cars. Now that means that somewhere along the line between when E. coli and we had a common ancestor, there have been a few little deletions and insertions. We lost a few railroad cars here or there, but they're still pretty much the same size. Now the question we want to ask is, in that train made up of 20 different kinds of railroad car, how many of the railroad cars would you expect to find at exactly the same position now, what we would say, 2 billion years later? Now, would you, of course, think, well, maybe they would all be exactly the same. Maybe there's never been any change. Maybe they were just made once, and that's the way it is in everything. Or maybe they were made independently, and you think about all the different ways you could take 20 railroad cars and put them together in a train. Becomes an astronomical number. I'm sure that Dr. Gish will tell us some of those astronomical numbers later. At any rate, we're going to line them up now, the two railroad trains, and when we do that, we find that the enzyme that occurs in the bacterium, that 122 of the railroad cars are at exactly the same position. I've got them marked over there with these asterisks. In other words, this one has an R, that one has an R, that one has a V, that one has a V, G and G, and so on. 46% of the railroad cars are exactly at the same position. Now, how could that be by chance? The easiest interpretation is that at one time these were the same, and now there have been these mutations that have been occurring, and natural selection operating over the eons to give us this, both functional enzymes, quite different sequences, but so similar that it couldn't be by chance. So here comes the principle. The principle is that if we now take proteins or nucleic acids, different creatures, rabbits and birds and whatever, jellyfish and so on, viruses, when we assemble those sequences and line them all up, those creatures that are most closely related will have the most closely related sequences. Those creatures that are most distantly related will have the most distantly related sequences. Furthermore, we can tell a computer how to do this, and then we can do a big experiment. And I'm going to tell you about that experiment in a moment, now that we're going to switch to the slides. Try power. Duane, I may need help. I think the power may not be on the machine. Hold the tape. Okay, well, it's all right. I think that I can continue without them. I'll tell you what's on the first slide. What we're going to do now is I'm going to switch the business a little bit, just switch reels, take advantage of this. And let me just break the rest of the talk into about 3 components. I'm going to deal first of all with ages. In order for all this change to occur, there's got to be time available. And so one of the big arguments that, of course, the scientist has relative to, there we go, good. The scientist has relative to the creationist is the notion of time. And so here are some of the times that I'm going to accept for tonight. Just focus a little bit here. Okay, now I'm going to contend that the universe is about 15 billion years old. I don't know how many of you read this morning's paper and saw a picture on the front of the LA Times, for example, beautiful picture, edge of the universe. more proof for the Big Bang. Very, very interesting one that I'm sure we can come back to in the discussion later. But we're going to accept the notion, I'm going to accept the notion, that the universe is 15 billion years old. The oldest stars are, of course, about that same age. They got going very early. Meteorites, which are showering on the Earth all the time, can be measured by various radio dating techniques and shown to be about 4.6 billion years old. They, of course, are a part of our solar system and were made at the time that we were getting together all the goods to make our own sun and Earth and the other planets. The oldest moon rocks that were brought back by the astronauts, same age. So I'm going to contend and tell you here now that I'm a believer, and as most scientists are, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Now, I have to tell you that in all my debates with Duane over the years, I've always tried him to come out in public and tell me how old he thinks the Earth is. Now, he's gotten in later stages to waffling a bit. He's never given a number, and he says it's not an issue. Some creationists think the Earth is quite old. Some think it's quite young. It's not an issue. Now, why isn't it an issue? It seems to me it's the focus of all this. All this evolution takes tremendous amount of time. Furthermore, human beings have only been involved in the process and the outcome of all of this for just an inkling in all this time, just a mere 5 or 7 million years instead of the 4.6 billion years that the Earth has existed, and the earliest life forms going back to about 3 billion years ago. So time and age are very important businesses here. Okay. These are some important dates that go with that, because it shows on the slide the first replicating systems were probably occurring back at, you know, there's got to be a trick to this. I got it. The first replicating systems back about 3.5 billion years ago. Bacteria and people and what we call nucleated organisms split 1.5 to 2 billion years ago. Plants and animals about 1 billion years, and then vertebrates, this is now going to be us versus the arthropods, for example, the insects that are taking over the Earth, 500,000 or 600 million years ago. And then mammals, everything less than 100 million years. Now these are all dates that are based on stratigraphy and radio dating. So my second question for Dr. Gish, I hope someone will ask him if he doesn't answer it. The first one is, how old is the Earth? Second, do you accept the principle of radio dating? All right, we're going to really start womping now. And so I'm going to flash through the slides. I've only got 15 minutes left according to the sign now, and tell you some of the events early in the Earth's history. All right, first, I do believe in the Big Bang. I think, as I say, there's great evidence for it. I'll defend it later in the discussion. All right, besides the Big Bang, we're losing time on the switch, there's a very important principle that goes with the Big Bang and how it contributed to everything that is existing on the Earth today. This slide, which is hard to read, I understand that, is a slide of temperature versus time. What we have over on the left side over there is this is now the temperature in degrees Kelvin. Very, very hot temperatures when it starts, 10 to the 10th degrees, extraordinarily hot. Getting right down here, this is room temperature where we are now. Sounds like, I think tonight we're up a little bit on the curve in here, but someplace around there, which is around 300 degrees Kelvin. Now this time is a graph in seconds going back. That's how old the Earth is in seconds. And you can see that what happened at the beginning is that things just began to cool down, all sorts of nuclear events and so on. And then there's a point where hydrogen, which is the key here, starts becoming helium. All right, and then some other things are going to happen, and I'll show you on the next slide. Here is the beginning of our solar system. This in seconds is about 4.6 billion years ago. All right, this illegible slide shows you something about the distribution of the elements in the cosmos. If we look at the abundance of the elements, what we see is number one is still hydrogen. Hydrogen accounts for 90% of the mass of the whole universe. Almost everything is hydrogen. And although Dr. Gish may lampoon it later, hydrogen is still what gets turned into people if you give it 3 billion years. Okay, the second most abundant element is helium. And then the others are all going to be made from helium. Now, it's a good thing, of course, that hydrogen is made from helium, the Earth is depending on the sun doing this all the time. You might notice that we're making a more complicated atom from a less complicated atom here and releasing energy, and of course this is the basis for all the sun's energy that radiates onto the Earth and keeps us all going today. Besides hydrogen going to helium, a well-known process, the helium then tumbles together in the interior of stars and gets made into other elements: carbon, oxygen, neon, all these other elements. And their abundance is proportional to the processes by which these atoms collide in the form of heliums to make them. Very interesting that the even-numbered elements are much more common than the odd-number elements because of the adding 4 units at a time when you put together 2 helium atoms to make another, and so on and so on. All right, let's go on to the next here quickly. Now later, Dr. Gish is going to make a big deal about the fact that thermodynamics is supposed to say that you can never make ordered things from disordered things. Now, that seems contrary, but of course it's taken out of context. Thermodynamics is a wonderful and beautiful subject. It is a big, complex system of definitions and ways to make everything come out balanced in terms of definitional properties. But it is, of course, possible to take atoms and make molecules without any help or assistance from any divine body. These are small organic molecules that are found in space. A simple molecule called hydrogen cyanide, which is usually thought of as being a deathly thing, and yet is the basis of all life. And when you, in fact, mix together some hydrogen cyanide, just shine in a little ultraviolet light, as well, of course, the sun will bring us increasingly more and more as the hole in the ozone layer gets bigger. At any rate, you shine in a little ultraviolet light, bing, what comes out the other side? Adenine. Adenine is a principal molecule in the formation of the nucleic acids. Now, I don't want to make this sound easier than it is. So on this next slide, I've written here the 4 stages or 5 stages that must have occurred in the origin of life. It's an old slide, and I'll quickly run through it even though you can't read it. The first part up here says you've got to make small molecules, these building blocks we've been talking about. No problem. Every one of them can be made gracefully under very, very temperate conditions. The second one is hooking those molecules together to make what we call polymers, to make proteins and nucleic acids. Big problem, very big problem, not understood yet. Now you can make small ones, people do this, but it's an exciting field and nobody quite knows the answer to that yet. But after all, this is a field that's only 40 years old. The next one down there says when in fact you've got those long chains of RNA going around, for example, that you now get into the business of self-replicating systems. I probably have to use my rebuttal time to go into that a little bit in more detail. And then finally get the whole thing going. Now, I can't tell you this in detail, and so I brought you a reference. And on this next slide, if this darn thing would move ahead here, I have to tell you there's some kind of electric stator here. Can you lower that a little bit? The publisher is well known to be the Cambridge University Press. The author is Karen Smith. Up at the top here is a wonderful title of a book that I recommend that every young person read. It's called 7 Clues to the Origin of Life. I'm looking for the day I find it on the materials table going in and out of one of these debates here. It's a beautiful book, a scientific detective story. Now, Karen Smith is no fast talker. He points out that there are some terrific problems to be solved in how the origin of life got going. But he lays them out clearly and tells the experiments that we should be doing that someday we may be able to understand it. So I don't want to masquerade here. There are a lot of things we don't understand about the early events in the history of life. All right, now, who have we here? Well, we have here, I think if I see this correctly, can you lower the lights just a little bit so we can get some glimmer of what we have on this slide? It would be good. Videotape notwithstanding. Well, I'm going to read them to you whether you would like it or not. Down the bottom, starting here, it says C, C, G, A, G, G, A, G, A, G, A, A, G, G, A. Can we lower the lights so I can stop reading? Okay? Now, I think you're not quite ready. Oh, I see. It's clear now. It's Duane. What we have there, all those A's and G's and C's and T's, is Dr. Gish. But of course, it's also me. It's all of you. This is a piece of human DNA. All right? That is what we are, except that we have 4 billion of them strung together. Now, someplace among the 4 billion, where there are differences among us, differences that make some of us a little balder at the top, some of us a little taller or shorter, but the differences are a very, very tiny fraction. There are probably only 3,000 or 4,000 differences, one to another, among the 4 billion of the people sitting in the room. But it's a very important thing. All of this now, of course, is under the Human Genome Project, that this whole sequence is being unraveled. We're seeing it step by step. It has matters of great matter of import for your health to know about these. Now, these DNA molecules are all put together, of course, in double helices. A versus T, C versus G, and so on. This is the principle, the complementary principle of Watson-based pairing that allows the information to be passed along from one to another. Here's another one in color. And this next one, tell you what, Duane, if I just ask you to push the button on the next slide, I can't make that darn thing go there. That's DNA again in color. Try it again, Duane. See if you can make it go. Good. All right. Now, there are several steps here. What happens is that when DNA comes apart and you put small molecules on it as a template, you make more DNA. And of course, that's where you make the mistakes that we call mutations. Now, DNA gets copied to RNA, and when the RNA gets translated into a polypeptide, and this is the process of how all living things, all creatures, make their proteins today. Well, almost all. Some viruses don't do it this way. They start at the RNA stage. They use RNA as their genetic material, and that's where they make their errors. Can we get the next slide, Jane? All right, well, these are, in fact, the different creatures of the Earth today, just put out into the various kingdoms. And this is our first example of a phylogenetic tree. Bacteria on the left. Over here on this side, we have plants and animals and fungi. If it were true, we should be able to take proteins from all these creatures, line them all up, and then have a computer make a tree for us without us telling the computer where the sequences came from. And if evolution were true, in fact, the picture would look just about the same. And we're going to have to, I think I'll try it again here. Now we'll go faster. We're running down here on the last 3 minutes. Here, for example, is a tree. I think the lighting is poor. I'm really feeling bad that you can't see these glorious pictures. This is a bunch of creatures along the top here, and these are all animals. Here's a fish over on this side, and then we move along down here. We're going all the way down to jellyfish at the other end over there. And this is how the biologists, before molecular biology came along, would have categorized these creatures, the invertebrates and the vertebrates over in this corner over here. Now we're going to look at it. How would the computer do it if we only gave it, I'm going to skip by the fossil record here. That was a chimpanzee we just went by. 99.9% the same for most of its proteins, it turns out. We're going to go past that. Here we're going to tell the computer, take these sequences. Now, put them in the best possible order. That means put the most similar ones near each other and the most distant ones more distant, and make a tree that is arithmetically perfect here. Just take and tell us how are all these creatures really related. And when we do that, computer now, I feel like Alice in Wonderland here. Okay, here's a tree that the computer made in color, but I'm going to give you one. Here is a tree that the computer made with hemoglobin molecules. Now later, Dr. Gish is probably going to tell you about hemoglobin molecules, but we're going to look and see. Up at the top is the human molecule. There's a pig. Now remember, the computer puts it in this order. We didn't put it in this order. Okay, well, turn the lights out so you can see. You can have your choice of hearing me or seeing if someone would turn the lights down a little bit. It's not fair not to see the visual aids. All right, up at the top is a human. There's a pig, an ostrich, crocodile, an axolotl, that's an amphibian, fishes, lampreys, now very primitive fish, invertebrate animals, all the way down to plants here. In other words, the computer put this in the order that Linnaeus would have liked just on the basis of what things look like by using only digital information from protein sequences. Nobody told it. What is the take-home message for this? That the closer organisms are thought to be related, it is true that the sequences of their genes are in fact closer to them. How could this come about? Only by divergent evolution. Now, of course, anything is possible. I would have to confess that. I have one more reference to get out before we get off the stage here. All right. This is a new book by a friend of mine at UCLA. Thanks. The Rise and Fall of the Third Chimpanzee by Jared Diamond. And Jared is a professor at UCLA, as I mentioned. And as it turns out, there are two groups of DNA, of chimps out in the wild today. Pygmy chimps and other chimps, the common chimp. The third chimp, according to Jared, is us. Now, he makes a beautiful story defending not only the principles of evolution in our relationship, but why we all have to accept this, what the consequences are for all human beings on the surface of the earth today. So, although I can't go through every detail of it here, those that are curious, pick up this book. It's a real beauty. All right, we're down to where we're down on the last 30 seconds of the tape. I'm just going to now make a quick summary statement of what I had hoped to accomplish here. First, we're only beginning tonight. This is the first presentation. Dr. Gish will have a presentation. Then I will have a chance to rebut, and he will have a chance to rebut. It's impossible, of course, to convince an audience, especially if they had views ahead of time, of the rightfulness of somebody else's ways. I've hoped to plant a few seeds. My main message was, all the creatures on the earth are made of the small same building blocks. They're put together in different order. Those orders, the sequences, when we look at them, mirror the way evolution has occurred over the last 3 billion years. We can see the differences, we can see the trees, and it's all perfectly natural. It's the simplest interpretation. Simplest, what we call the principle of parsimony, is the way that I have chosen. So thank you very much for listening so patiently. I've used up my time.
Dr. Doolittle, I want to thank you and apologize about the machines. I assure you we didn't plan that. You have got about 5 minutes, I hope long enough to stretch, and we will start again promptly. Thank you. Men and women, we're needing your help. We need you to bring it down. We're losing time that we need. Dr. Duane Gish, would you please come up and share with us? You want to wait? Dr. Gish said he'd like to wait until people are back and not talking. We need you to help us. We've got a lot of people.
Well, it certainly is my pleasure to be here this evening and to have this opportunity to present the results of our research on the subject of origins. And let me say, first of all, that I have great respect for the work of Dr. Doolittle in his attempt to determine the sequence of various proteins and to investigate those structures and to relate those structures to the properties of, say, a worm on one hand, a chimpanzee on the other, and a human on the other. I think that's good work. I think it's work that is very valuable work that demonstrates why, in some cases, chimpanzees are chimpanzees, humans are humans, and worms are worms. And so I want to give credit to Dr. Doolittle for this important work. I do not believe, however, that it gives us any idea about the origin of man, or the origin of a worm, or the origin of a tiger, or anything like that. You see, that's the inference. the data, the observations, what Dr. Doolittle has carefully pointed out, these are the data. These are the observations. Now, what he infers from that, you see, starting with the assumption that evolution is a fact. The greatest proof, you see, for an evolutionist that life has evolved is that life exists. That's the proof, you see, of evolution. That's the assumption. So all of his inferences go on from there. Now, I am very pleased that Dr. Doolittle has not mentioned anybody's theology or quoted anybody's theology, because this is not a debate about anybody's theology. Not even a debate about the age of the earth, as Dr. Doolittle has pointed out. I point out that there are creations who take both positions on the age of the earth. Some believe the earth is very old, some believe it's very young. He has challenged me to give my idea on the age of the earth. Well, I'll do it right now. I believe there's much evidence to indicate that the earth is very young, that it's not millions or billions of years old. Now, there's no way to prove that. I don't believe there's any way to determine the age of the earth. I don't think you can do that. I think there's processes that establish upper limits on the age of the earth, on the age of various things. But you cannot date the earth by any method. But the important thing is how. And I don't care whether you call creation religion, I don't care whether you call evolution religion, I don't care what you call it. I'm interested in the truth. How did we get here? Now, by creation we mean a supernatural origin, that there is a creator, external to and independent of the natural universe, that through the deliberate, intelligent acts of that creator, the universe was brought into existence. The stars, the planets, the solar system, life on this planet, man, and all other living organisms. Each basic category was separately created. In other words, cats have always been cats, dogs have always been dogs, onions have always been onions, roses have always been roses, monkeys have always been monkeys, and people have always been people, right from the very beginning. Variation within the limits, of course, of each kind. As Darwin noted, when he visited the Galapagos Islands, he saw the varieties of finches. Some had large beaks, some small beaks, some ate seeds, some ate fruit, and so forth and so on. He took this evidence for limited variation and extrapolated it into unlimited variation, assuming that finches, canaries, eagles, ducks had evolved from a common ancestor, and that birds, in turn, had evolved from a reptile. He made that great leap of faith. The creation scientist points out that these finches are not only still birds, they're still finches, you see. And so each kind remains that basic kind from the very beginning. So we postulate a supernatural, spatial creation of the universe and all that it contained. Now we can contrast that to Dr. Doolittle's theory, which is totally mechanistic, naturalistic. Now, I don't want to infer that all evolutionists are atheists. Certainly they are not. Most of them are not. But the theory of evolution is an atheistic theory. That is a non-theistic theory. God is not involved. God is not necessary. Everything occurred according to properties inherent in matter. By definition, God is excluded from the process, you see. So evolution is naturalistic, mechanistic, non-theistic, and still continuing today, while creation is theistic, supernatural, and finished. That's the two basic theories that we are discussing here tonight. Now, there's various submodels within the creation model. There are old agers, young agers, gap theories, and so forth. And among the evolutionists, there's the neo-Darwinists, such as Dr. Doolittle. There's the punctuated equilibrium people. There's the hopeful monster people, and so forth and so on. But they all fit under the same umbrella, you see. Now, there's a tremendous turmoil among evolutionists today. You see, paleontologists, those people who studied fossils, finally are recognizing the fact that we cannot find what Darwin said we ought to find in the fossil record, among other things. He said we should find a continuous string of intermediates, transitional forms. They should be almost innumerable. Now, of course, we would not expect to find all transitional forms, of course. There would be gaps, but there would be many, many of these transitional forms. Well, evolutionists, paleontologists have recognized that the gaps between the really basic categories, phyla, classes, orders, and so forth, are systematic. We don't find these transitional forms as required by the theory. That is, many are beginning to say that today. Some would defend the old idea. This has generated a lot of turmoil in evolutionary circles. They say, of course, that's healthy. It's healthy in science to have controversy and discussions and so forth. I think it goes beyond that. Here's an article published in Newsweek, April 8, 1985. That's 7 years ago. The author is Sharon Begley. The title of the article was Science Contra Darwin. That is, Science Against Darwin. In her opening statement, she says this: the great body of work deriving from Charles Darwin's revolutionary 1859 book On the Origin of Species is under increasing attack, and not just from creationists. Then she goes on to describe some of this infighting and quarreling among evolutionists. Then she says this: so heated is the debate that one Darwinian says there are times when he thinks about going into a field with more intellectual honesty, the used car business. My apologies to any used car salesman in the audience. Of course, that wasn't a creationist who said that, that was an evolutionist. Now, let me make clear, these people are all evolutionists, but you see what is going on here because of the problems. Now, in 1985, a very important book was published by Dr. Michael Denton. Dr. Denton has 2 earned doctorates from British universities, an MD degree, and a PhD in molecular biology. He's not a Christian, does not even profess to be a creationist, but he published a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. This book is a devastating critique of evolution theory. On every count, according to Dr. Denton, evolution strikes out. On the flap of the book, for example, we read the following: the theory of evolution as propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by a practicing scientist presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution. Later on we read, most important of all, the discoveries of molecular biologists, of whom Michael Denton is one, far from strengthening Darwinian claims, are throwing more and more doubt upon the correctness of the whole theory, end quote. Please note, Dr. Denton, just as is Dr. Doolittle, is a molecular biologist. That is his conclusion from his research, and I'll show more of that later. Finally, 1987, a book was published by a very famous Swedish scientist. I say famous, he's well known throughout the world for his work in biology. This man is definitely an evolutionist, no question about it. I heard him speak when I was in Jerusalem a number of years ago. He and I had been invited to Hebrew University to address what they called the first annual conference on origins and evolution. Both creation scientists and evolution scientists had been invited to this conference. When I heard Dr. Lovetrap speak, I knew immediately he was not a Darwinian, as is Dr. Doolittle. He said that mutations and natural selection had nothing to do with evolution. He was more or less an advocate of the hopeful monster mechanism. This is a notion, for example, that at one time a reptile laid an egg and a bird was hatched from the egg. Just like that, overnight you go from a reptile to a bird. Must have been a tremendous shock to Mama Reptile when that happened. I think she would have given up motherhood. But they suggested these big jumps because they say there's no transitional forms between these major kinds, you see. Now, Dr. Lovetrop was more or less an advocate of that position. He published a book in 1987 entitled Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. Darwinism, the Refutation of a Myth. What he calls the Darwinian myth is what is being taught as fact now at our universities here in San Diego, throughout California, throughout the United States, the major universities. That is what's being taught as a fact. It's taught as fact, it's inscribed in stone. He calls the Darwinian myth. In this book, he reviews the history of Darwinism, brings it up to the modern times, the modern theory of Darwinism. He describes his objections to the theories, why he thinks it cannot be correct. Then he describes his own notions about evolution, which more or less is the advocate of some big jumps or hopeful monster mechanism, something like that. Then he says this is on page 422 of his book. He says, quote, "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science." Let me quote that again, please. "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science." Think of that, ladies and gentlemen. If this man is correct, he's an evolutionist, he's a very well-known scientist. If that man is correct, what is being taught as fact in almost all of our major universities is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Now, of course, we creation scientists go one step beyond that. We say not only is this Darwinian notion of evolution, supported by Dr. Doolittle, is the greatest deceit in the history of science, but the very notion of evolution is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Now, we want to hasten to add, we do not believe evolutionists are deliberately dishonest. No, not at all. But you see, they have been deceived, or they have deceived themselves in believing something that is totally wrong. And so certainly we would agree with this famous Swedish scientist and evolutionist that Darwinism is the greatest deceit in the history of science. That is the modern theory that is being taught in our universities today. Now, I want to, Dr. Doolittle has presented me with several challenges, which I certainly will answer before the evening is over with, so I want to present him with a few challenges. Challenges that evolutionists must answer. Challenges to which I have never had any answer whatsoever. In all of the debates I've had, nobody has answered my challenge, and experts in the field. Now, first of all, I want to challenge Dr. Doolittle. We need to turn out some of these lights here now. On metamorphosis. Now, many insects go through the process of metamorphosis. Frogs do, you know, they go from the egg to the tadpole to the adult frog. They're completely different organisms in this process. It's called metamorphosis. I'll use the monarch butterfly as an example. Here we see the adult monarch butterfly. Now, as you know, the female lays eggs. We see the developing egg on the right here, and we know what happens. It produces a caterpillar. We see the caterpillar has mouth parts for chewing leaves and has legs. So it crawls around in each leaf. It crawls around in each leaf, and it crawls around in each leaf, and that's about all it does. Now, apparently, according to evolution, at some stage during history, maybe it got an urge to hang glide or something like that. And it saw all these things flying around, which seemed like a wonderful way of life, so it thought it'd like to become a flying creature. But it realized, I mean, there's absolutely nothing in a caterpillar that would recommend it to become a flying creature. How could you change legs into wings and so forth? So it had a brilliant idea. It'd go right back down to ground zero and start all over again. Sure enough, here's the final stage of the caterpillar after several molts and so forth. And then it fastens the pro leg on the end to a twig or something, curls its head around, and it makes one last molt. Now here it's in the process of making a final molt. From this stage to the next stage, I am told, takes 60 to 140 seconds. That's all. 1 minute to about 1.5 minutes, this creature changes into this chrysalis. Now here's the cocoon, the chrysalis. Now that itself is an engineering marvel. That itself is a miracle in itself. That chrysalis. Inside the chrysalis, now the caterpillar is nothing more hardly than a mass of jelly. A little bit more, it has a little beating heart, but the rest is just jelly. Now it went down to ground zero, all right, but now how do you program a mass of jelly to become a butterfly? You see, that's a pretty big problem. How do you do that? How would evolution do that? How would evolution change a caterpillar into a butterfly? Would it change the feet a little bitty bit at a time into wings, and change the mouth part for chewing leaves and the long proboscis for sucking nectar? Would that? Now, Dr. Doolittle says all this happens by mutations. These are just genetic accidents. They're genetic mistakes. All of this has just happened by a bunch of mistakes, you want to understand. And yet, just by accident, each little mistake somehow worked out and changed this thing into a butterfly. How would genetic mistakes change a mass of jelly into a butterfly? How would it program that? How could you go step by step by step from an egg to a caterpillar to a chrysalis, then to a butterfly? Well, sure enough, that's what happens. We see the developing butterfly inside the chrysalis. Then it breaks out, very short time, pumps the fluid from its tummy into the wings. The wings straighten out and dry, and now we have the monarch butterfly. Now, Darwin said this: if you could describe one example of a structure, an organ, or an organism, which the origin of which could not be explained by his theory, you would falsify his theory. I say the metamorphosis, this process, this butterfly, or anything else, falsifies evolution. There is no way you can explain this process by evolution. That is the origin of the process. Now, I don't want anybody to get up here and describe the process itself. Certainly, with our knowledge of chemistry and so forth, we someday might know what all the enzymes involved are, what the hormones involved are, and so forth and so on. I'm not talking about the process itself. I'm talking about the origin of the process. I can explain the function of my watch knowing physics and the properties of matter. I can explain that watch, but that does not tell me whatsoever how that watch came to be, you see. That's what I'm challenging Dr. Doolittle tonight, to explain the origin of this metamorphosis process. Now, we have some other challenges for Dr. Doolittle. I don't know, probably can't see that slide very well, but on this slide we have a reconstruction of organisms whose fossils are found in Cambrian rock. Evolutionists believe Cambrian rocks are about 600 million years old. That is the beginning of these Cambrian rocks. They believe the Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago. And if you take all the Cambrian rocks, all of the earth, and total them all up, take about 80 million years for these rocks to form. That is, if this sediment settled out just a wee bit at a time, you see, a little bit each year. That's the way it happened. Take 80 million years for all these rocks to form. Now, first of all, I don't have the foggiest notion how you get fossils like that. I mean, when an animal just dies and lies out on the ground and floats around the water, it's just gone, that's all. Never becomes a fossil. For a creature to become a fossil, it must be buried, and buried quickly and catastrophically. And then these Cambrian rocks literally are billions times billions of fossils of these creatures all over the earth. They are very, very complicated creatures. We have trilobites, we have sea urchins, we have sponges, we have jellyfish, we have the swimming crustaceans, we have clams, snails, brachiopods, worms, and a great variety of other very, very complicated invertebrates. Evolutionists believe that these things evolved, began with a little microscopic organism several billion years earlier. All right, now we started with a little microscopic organism which evolved into a multicellular organism, and then which diversified in this great array of very complicated creatures, according to evolution. Now, if that is true, then in the pre-Cambrian rocks, the rocks which generally underlie the Cambrian, not always, but generally, many of those pre-Cambrian rocks are undisturbed. They are perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. If the fossils are there, they would be found. In those pre-Cambrian rocks, we must find the ancestors of these Cambrian animals. if evolution is true. Billions times billions of those must be found. There's no question about it. We should have absolutely no problem finding the ancestors of trilobite, or sponges, or jellyfish, or worms, or clams, or snails. Ladies and gentlemen, nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found ancestors for a single one of those creatures. We have no ancestors for clams. We have no ancestors for sponges, or jellyfish, or worms, or trilobites. They appear explosively without any ancestors or transitional forms. I have a photocopy of a page out of the book Evolutionary Biology, 2nd edition by Douglas Futima, well-known evolutionist, published in 1986. On page 324 of that book, this is what this evolutionary biologist says. He says, quote, "It is considered likely that all the animal phyla became distinct before or during the Cambrian, for they all appear fully formed without intermediates, connecting one phylum to another." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it, right out from the book by an evolutionist. Every one of these major kinds, each in a separate phylum, they're so different, they suddenly appear fully formed, just as Dr. Futima, this evolutionist, said, without intermediates. Evolution is dead. Evolution is absolutely dead. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot have hundreds of millions of years of evolution producing this vast array of very complicated invertebrates and not leave a trace. That's just not possible. We should have billions times billions of fossils of the transitional forms and the intermediates. They do not exist. Now that kills evolution. Evolution demands continuity. You cannot have discontinuity. We don't have to describe anything further in the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen. That settles the question. But there is much more. Evolutionists suggest that one of these invertebrates evolved into the vertebrates. They believe the fishes were the first vertebrates. Now that's a remarkable transformation, wouldn't you say? Changing a clam into a fish, or a worm into a fish, or a jellyfish into a fish, or a snail into a fish. That's a remarkable transformation. They said it took 100 million years, ladies and gentlemen, for an invertebrate to evolve into a fish. Ladies and gentlemen, we have billions times billions of fossils of the invertebrates. We have billions and billions of fossil fishes. If evolution is true, we ought to have billions times billions of transitional forms between the invertebrate and the fishes. We don't have one, not even one, and we ought to have billions and billions and billions of those things. There's no evidence, not one iota of evidence, that fishes evolved from some invertebrate. It is just an assumption. Here's an article published in American Zoologist, Volume 20, 1980, page 757 by Gerald Todd. He says this: all three subdivisions of the bony fishes first appear in the fossil record at approximately the same time. They are already widely divergent morphologically, and they are heavily armored. How did they originate? What allowed them to diverge so widely? How did they all come to have heavy armor? And why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? Let me repeat that last sentence again. Why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? Ladies and gentlemen, there's no trace, you see, of ancestors for the major kind of fish. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed without a trace of an ancestor. Ladies and gentlemen, it is just not physically possible to have 100 million years of evolution, converting some invertebrate into a fish and not leave a trace. That is not physically possible. Billion times billions of fossils, these things, billions and billions of fossil fishes and not one intermediate. Ladies and gentlemen, that shows certainly that fishes have not evolved. And there's much more in the fossil record. We find fossils of dinosaurs on every continent of the world. They found on the north shore of Alaska, and evolutionists believe that Alaska was even farther north when those things existed than it is today. They're found in Antarctica, found all over the world, in great diversity. If evolution is true, we ought to have all kinds of intermediate form for the dinosaurs. Well, we have horned dinosaurs. It's a triceratops with 3 horns on its face. 1-horned dinosaurs, 5-horned dinosaurs, 7-horned dinosaurs, they all appear fully formed. There's no series of intermediate showing these horns slowly evolving. Here's Stegosaurus, no horns on the head, has 4 spikes on the tail and those plates along the back, of which we have no idea what purpose they really did serve, but they are very substantial, very unusual. Look at those spikes, about 3 feet long. If evolution is true, we ought to have a series of intermediate showing the gradual evolution of those structures. We don't have one. Here's the Trachodon, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs, has a huge duck bill, as we see in this picture. Evolutionists, and there are many fossils of duck-billed dinosaurs, many different kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs. Evolutionists believe that jaws and teeth gradually evolved into duck bills. We ought to have many, many, many intermediates. We don't have one, not even one. Every duck-billed dinosaur appears fully formed. Here is the great meat-eating dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus rex, jaws about 6 feet long, teeth about 6 inches long. No wonder they call them dinosaurs or terrible lizards. The great Diplodocus, the great plant-eating dinosaur. We see the man standing in front of this 100-foot-long dinosaur. Here's the great Brontosaurus. We're supposed to call him Apatosaurus now. The great thunder lizard, weighed about 40 tons, about 75 to 80 feet long. We see the largest dinosaur of all, the great Brachiosaurus, standing 50 feet high, weighing up to 100 tons or 200,000 pounds. Had a very strange anatomy. His nostrils are not located out on the end of the snout, but in that bony dome on the top of the head. Nobody knows why he had this strange anatomy, but one thing we do know, ladies and gentlemen, we have no transitional form showing the nostril migrating gradually into the bony dome on the top of the head. Every one of these dinosaurs appears fully formed, ladies and gentlemen. I've searched and searched the literature for transitional forms for these things, and none are forthcoming. They just don't exist. And that's tremendous, powerful, positive evidence for creation. Here's a statement from Dr. David Kitts. He is an evolutionist. He got his training in paleontology under George Gaylord Simpson, famous evolutionist. In an article published in Evolution, volume 28, 1974, on page 467, this evolutionist, paleontologist, geologist, said this, and it's not taken out of context. The article was about evolution, paleontology, and the gaps in the fossil record. That's what the article was about. He says, quote, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. End of quote. Why is Dr. Kitts an evolutionist? Not because of the evidence, obviously, but in spite of the evidence, you see. He says the evolution actually requires transitional forms, but the fossil record does not produce them. Well, very brief look at human origins. This is Australopithecus, first discovered in South Africa in 1924. This is skull discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959. We see these things are grossly ape-like, very grossly ape-like. This is the fossil discovered by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia in later in the 70s. He named these creatures Australopithecus afarensis. Found a series of similar creatures. One was of a female, about 40% complete. He called her Lucy. And he became famous overnight for his discovery of Lucy because he claimed that although she was grossly ape-like from the neck up, she walked upright just like you and me. Here's the skull of Lucy, and they said when they reconstructed it, looked like a small female gorilla. But it's claimed that this creature walked upright, so it must be related to human origin. Well, that is the consensus. That's just what most evolutionists believe. You find that in your textbooks, on TV, and so forth. But not all evolutionists believe that. Not all experts believe that. Lord Zuckerman, very famous British anatomist, had a scientific team, rarely numbered less than 4, that studied these creatures for 15 years. And he was studying fossils of Australopithecus, supposedly 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy, more recent in time than Lucy, should be more man-like, more advanced than Lucy itself. After these many years of research using the most highly sophisticated methods of anatomy known, Lord Zuckerman declared these creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate between ape and man. Dr. Charles Oxnard, another expert who studied these fossils for many years, studying the foot bones, the leg bones, the knee joints, the pelves, and so forth. This man, using the very best, the latest methods of anatomy, declared that these creatures are not intermediate. We're not intermediate between ape and man. They did not walk upright, certainly not in a human manner, and they are not human ancestors. I believe that's the very best research that's being done on these creatures. That means you've got to take Lucy and her fellow creatures and throw them right out of the family tree of man. Please bear in mind when we read all this stuff and it's just proclaimed to be a fact, what has happened in the past, the sorry record of evolution studying human origin. For example, here's a picture I took in our own San Diego Museum of Man about 15 years ago of a creature called Ramapithecus. At that time, they said Ramapithecus was intermediate between ape and man. Here we see the creature standing erect, walking erect, not ape, not man, but intermediate. Now, what greater proof of evolution could you want than this here? Well, that was 15 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. In the meantime, they found more. All they had was a few teeth and a few fragments of the jaw at that time. Now they found more complete material, and the same people who were saying that then are now saying that Ramapithecus was essentially the same as a modern orangutan. Alan Walker has declared that the modern orangutan is a living fossil because he's essentially the same as this Ramapithecus, supposedly 17 million years old. You want to know what Ramapithecus really looked like? That's what he looked like. That's an orangutan, and not the intermediate presented before. Here's the Piltdown man. This is a picture published in 1937, based upon a few fragments of a jaw, a few fragments of a skull found in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England. Turned out to be 100% fake or fraud. Someone had taken a jawbone of an ape, a human skull, had treated them with chemicals to make them look old, altered the teeth to make them look man-like, planted the bones in a gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. The consensus of the world's greatest authorities, Piltdown man was a subhuman ancestor of man, and it was incredible how many human-like features they could see in that modern ape jaw and how many ape-like features they could see in that modern human skull. They weren't there at all, because that's what they wanted to see, that's what they had expected to see. 1922, one single tooth found in western Nebraska, and it created a great deal of excitement among evolutionists at that time because they thought they could see characteristics in that tooth intermediate between ape and man. They couldn't quite decide was an ape-like man or a man-like ape. They called him Nebraska man. In 1922, the Illustrated London News published a picture of Nebraska man based upon the description of those scientists. We see that in this picture, and it says, astounding discovery, you see, of a man or man-like creature in Pliocene strata based upon that tooth. Here we see the man, we see his wife, we see the tools they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Just as Mark Twain once said, science is really a fascinating subject, isn't it? You can get just wholesale production of conjectures from just a trifling investment of fact. Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of this creature. He turned out to be neither an ape-like man or a man-like ape. He turned out to be a pig. That's right, more than a pig's tooth. Ladies and gentlemen, there's your ancestor who had been presented to you in the 1920s as evidence for your evolution based upon nothing more than a pig's tooth. Then we have the Neanderthal people. This is a museum model of Neanderthal people. Neanderthal man that stood for many, many, many years. They thought he was a very primitive, subhuman ancestor of man. It turned out these creatures suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. One of the fossils they based a lot of their conclusion was an arthritic old man. The only reason he didn't walk upright, he had a bad case of arthritis. They now conclude Neanderthal people were fully human, Homo sapiens. And here we see the modern day version of Neanderthal man from the American Museum of Natural History. About 35 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article about Neanderthal people, and they said, now really, if you just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit, place him on the New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 35 years ago. Of course, today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? Some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath, and he'd do very nicely. But he certainly was not our ancestor. He was human, Homo sapiens. Now you see, ladies and gentlemen, what do we have here? Time after time after time, they strip these things out of the family tree of man. Don't worry, they'll always have something there, you see. But when we look at what has happened here, doesn't that create a rather healthy skepticism? When somebody presents something like this, I say, okay, let's just wait 25, 30 years, 50 years from now. Let's see what the conclusions are, you see. Well, let me give you the conclusion of Lord Zuckerman. Lord Zuckerman was an evolutionist, or is an evolutionist, not a creationist, no bias towards our point of view. He published a book in 1970 called Beyond the Ivory Tower. Now, he was familiar with most of the evidence that we still have today. Lord Zuckerman studied, he is searching for man's fossil ancestry for many, many years. This is his field of expertise. Lord Zuckerman had 2 chapters in this book concerning the search for man's fossil ancestry. First of all, he says there's just no science in this field at all. He says out here on this end of the spectrum you have chemistry and physics, then you have biology, then you have the social sciences. Way out on the other end of the spectrum you have ESP and the search for man's fossil ancestry. That's where he put the search for man's fossil ancestry. Lord Zuckerman, in this book, page 64, an evolutionist, expert in this field, said this: if we exclude the possibility of creation, then obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there is absolutely no trace of it in the fossil record. That's the expert opinion of this evolutionist after a lifetime of research in the field. I agree with Lord Zuckerman that if man has evolved from some ape-like creature, there is certainly no evidence for it in the fossil record. Now, I want to get a little more into Dr. Doolittle's field. He gave you some data, then he made an inference. He said, all creatures have the same amino acids. We have the same nucleotides, same purines and pyrimidines and sugars. I certainly agree with that. He says, now from that we infer we all had a common ancestor. That's his inference. Let me tell you, it couldn't be any other way if God created everything. Because supposing God created plants with a certain kind of amino acids and sugars and purines and pyrimidines, then suppose when he created animals, he used a different kind of amino acids and sugars, purines and pyrimidines. Then when he created man, he used a third kind of amino acids and sugars and purines and pyrimidines. What could we eat? We couldn't eat plants. We couldn't eat animals. The only thing we could eat would be each other. And I think we all agree that'd be a lousy solution. You see, plants, animals, and man must have the same amino acids. They must have the same sugars. They must have the same purines and pyrimidines. And then, of course, our biochemistry has to be very similar. Of course, the bacterium will change a sugar into energy the same way we do. Would you expect God to sit down and devise a new procedure every time he wanted to metabolize sugar? Why would he do that? He uses good, sound biochemical principles in designing the process and the enzymes and so forth. Of course, it's not identical in man. We have a different environment. We are human. We are not bacteria. We are not snakes. We are humans. And of course, since we are more similar to chimpanzees than we are snakes, I think you all agree that, although sometimes our wives call our husbands snakes and things like that, yet we recognize that we are more similar to chimpanzee than we are to snakes, and therefore our biochemistry is more similar, but it's got to be similar. It must be similar. There's no evidence for evolution whatsoever in that sort of thing. Now let's take a look at some of the data. Here's the structure of an enzyme. I know you can't read that, but I can't read it either, as a matter of fact. But it shows a sequence of 124 amino acids that makes this enzyme called ribonuclease, one of the digestive enzymes in your body. Every single molecule of ribonuclease produced by your body has that sequence. 20 different kinds of amino acids arranged in sequence, 124. Just like we take the 26 letters of the English alphabet, we arrange them in an infinite number of different ways, we get a message, providing we arrange them precisely. In a certain order, we have a message. If you give a monkey a typewriter and paper, he just produces nonsense. So it is here. Those amino acids must be arranged precisely. Not precisely the same, but fairly closely the same. There are some differences, of course, that can be accommodated, but they are rather precisely. Now, Dr. Doolittle says these enzymes and all the other proteins, the thousands and thousands of different kinds of proteins and DNA and RNA that we have in our body, he mentioned 4 million nucleotides. We have 4 million nucleotides in our genetic material arranged in precise order. He says all of this took place by chance. It just accidentally happened. Before you have life, you have no natural selection, you have no reproduction, no natural selection. It is pure chance. What is the probability you could get just one single molecule, one single protein by chance? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if I had 17 people lined up here in front of the auditorium, how many different ways do you suppose 17 people could line up? That is, rearranging themselves time after time after time after time? You're not going to believe it, but it's more than 355 trillion. More than 355 trillion. If you don't believe me, get 16 of your friends together after the meeting and try it. Don't bother. It's more than 355 trillion. That's just 17 people. In that molecule, there's 124. Since there are 20 different kinds of amino acids, assuming we only had these 20 different kinds, which is impossible on the primitive Earth, assuming they were all left-handed, instead of a mixture of right-handed and left-handed amino acids, which is impossible. There'd be a mixture of the left-handed and right-handed. Only the left-handed works. You've got to have left-handed. Assuming all of that, what is the probability they're accidentally going to get arranged in that order? 1/20 times itself, 124 times. Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't make any difference whether you put together one of these things every day or every month, or they all go together at the same time. The probability is the same. 1/20 times itself, 124 times. Forget it. It's not going to happen on this planet in 5 billion years or 500 billion years. Not even one single molecule, ladies and gentlemen. If you calculate the probability of getting something like that by chance, it's not going. If you could take those 124 amino acids, rearrange them 1 trillion times a second for 5 billion years, the probability they come out in that way is vanishingly small. But if it did happen, what would you have? One single molecule of one single protein. But ladies and gentlemen, to get life started, you've got to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules. You've got to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules and carbohydrates and much more to get life started. Just the most primitive living cell that one can imagine. Not going to happen, not on this planet, not in 1 billion years, 100 billion years, or 1,000 billion years. But if it did happen, you wouldn't get a living cell anyhow. A living cell is not a bag of chemicals. A living cell has complex membranes. It has energy factories, protein factories, genetic material, and everything is put together precisely like the mechanism of your watch. We see incredible complexity. We see a grand master plan, the way things must be put together precisely for life to function. We see purposefulness in every detail of the structure and function of that living cell. Ladies and gentlemen, I say that tremendous organization required an organizer. That tremendous master plan demands a master planner, and the evidence for purposefulness demands deliberate, intelligent creation. The idea that a living cell could have evolved naturally on this planet by the ordinary laws of chemistry and physics and whatever else is working on this planet is a myth. It is a 20th century myth that is devoid of any scientific credibility, except by those people who just want to believe it. Chemistry and physics just could not do it. Here we see a newspaper article published in the Daily Express of London, August 14, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who are those two scientists? Sir Fred Hoyle, famous British astronomer, Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe, also a well-known British astronomer. They became interested in the problem of the origin of life a number of years ago. First of all, they made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. Then they assumed that every planet in the entire universe had a planet, that every star in the entire universe had a planet like the Earth. Then they assumed the universe was 20 billion years old. Then they calculated the probability of life evolving somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer was astounding to these two scientists. According to their calculation, the probability was essentially nil. Sir Fred said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I say this. If Dr. Doolittle wants to believe that, or anyone else wants to believe that, that's their business. But don't call it science and don't teach it to your students. That is not science, ladies and gentlemen. That is myth. It's mythology. It's a 20th century myth. Now, these two scientists had no inclination to believe in creation. When they began these studies, they were both atheists. It was the conclusions of their science, their hard science, that compelled them to believe this. Wickramasinghe said he didn't feel very comfortable with this idea, but he said he couldn't find any logical way out of it. No, there's no logical way out of it, ladies and gentlemen. You see, the idea that this incredibly complex thing we call life evolved by chance through chemistry and physics or something like it is absolutely, totally false. It has no scientific credibility whatsoever. And we can see that based upon other principles as well. Here we see the Andromeda galaxy, 100 billion stars in a galaxy. Now, you know a star is very unusual, improbable arrangement of matter. If you bring a tank of gas in here and release it, it diffuses in all directions. It doesn't go over here in a corner and collect in a ball and become very hot. It doesn't do that, does it? So a star is a very unusual and very improbable arrangement of matter. When you put 100 billion of them into a galaxy, that's even vastly more improbable. Now, I know what you read in today's paper. Remember this: data is data and inference is inference. What they claimed they saw was the differences in the background radiation of 30 trillionth of a degree. 30 trillionth of a degree. Now, even they said they should be waiting for confirmation of this. 30 trillionth of a degree difference in the background radiation, and they say that proves the Big Bang. It doesn't prove any such thing. I've talked to some other people in this field who don't agree with the Big Bang, and they say there are other ways of explaining all this, and certainly 30 trillionth of a degree is so very, very incredibly slight. I say we better wait for some more data, and furthermore, they have no way, absolutely no way to explain the origin of that irregularity. They're postulating cold, dark matter, which nobody can see and nobody can detect. You might as well believe in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy as to believe in cold, dark matter. They have to have it or they can't get the universe they have today. That is not science, ladies and gentlemen. But one of the problems with this idea is this: the second law of thermodynamics. Ladies and gentlemen, evolutionists say we just don't understand the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics applies only to isolated systems or closed systems, not to open systems. Our Earth is open to the energy from the sun. There's no problem with evolution and the second law of thermodynamics. What does the second law of thermodynamics say? It tells us this: there's a universal natural tendency for everything to run down and decay. Our bodies wear out, our houses wear out, and so forth and so on. Dr. Asimov says in this statement about the second law of thermodynamics, he says another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, if that's what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, evolution is in trouble. Everything is going in the wrong direction for evolution to occur. Now, there's no doubt the second law of thermodynamics always applies to isolated or closed systems. Dr. Doolittle, listen carefully. In your view, the universe is an isolated system. Therefore, the second law of thermodynamics does apply to its origin. The second law of thermodynamics says an isolated system can go in one direction and one direction only, and that's downward. It will deteriorate. It will run down. It becomes less organized, less complex. It never, ever, ever becomes more complex, more organized, ever. And it can never happen. And yet evolutionists persist in believing this universe is an isolated system. Nobody did any work on it. Nobody brought anything in from the outside. It's an isolated system. It started in the chaos and disorder of the Big Bang and the simplicity of hydrogen gas, and transformed itself into everything in the universe today, including people. That means our human brain, with 12 billion brain cells and 120 trillion connections, ultimately is a product of hydrogen gas produced by the Big Bang. Ladies and gentlemen, that violates the second law of thermodynamics. There's no question about it. You just can't do that. No natural system, and the universe now is running down, as Dr. Asimov states. My challenge to Dr. Doolittle is this. If the natural laws and natural processes which are now governing the universe are leading inevitably to its death and destruction, and if, as they believe, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws and natural processes are all there is and all there ever has been, how could they create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very same natural laws and processes which are now destroying the universe, could they have been responsible for the origin of the universe in the first place? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? Ladies and gentlemen, evolution says you just take hydrogen gas and gravity and the universe creates itself. The second law of thermodynamics says that's impossible. That will not happen. And right now the universe is running down. It is deteriorating. It is going to die. If there is no God, or God would not intervene, it's going to die someday. That's for certain. How could it create itself then, you see? These are questions that evolutionists have never answered, and of course there is no answer. Ladies and gentlemen, I say, based upon the laws of probability, the laws of thermodynamics, the fossil record, and all the data that we can consider today, the best statement that we can make concerning our origin, scientifically speaking, is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you.